I'm Joe Devine, and welcome to the Tifo Football podcast. I was joined today by Seb Stafford-Bloor. This episode is split into two halves. In part one, we discussed Alexis Sanchez at Arsenal off the back of a recent article that Seb wrote for uMAXit.com. Part two is a new segment that we'll be introducing into the show whenever Seb makes an appearance. Seb is the sub-editor of the uMAXit editorial site, so in the second part, we briefly discussed the top 5 performing articles of last week, so stick around for that. Apologies in advance for some of the sound quality on this episode. We encountered a bit of an issue during recording, which was unfortunately uneditable. So there's a little bit of clicking now and then. Sorry about that. We know how important it is to listeners that the audio quality is top-notch, so we will be working on that to ensure that it doesn't become a regularity. It is totally listenable, though, and my hope is that you will forget all about it and enjoy the show. So thank you for downloading. Keep commenting, rating, and reviewing us. It really helps us reach new people. And away we go. Seb, last week you wrote an article about Alexis Sanchez titled "Alexis Sanchez Needs to Emerge from His Sulky Fog." In it, you speak of his seeming determination to let everyone know that he'd rather be somewhere else, of his performances betrayed by visible exasperation and flailing arms, and you describe him as embittered by the deadline day fiasco which left him marooned between Arsenal and Manchester City. It's fairly damning in parts, and perhaps not unfairly so, but I wondered if you could explain why you feel as strongly as the article suggests that you do.
I think partly it's because, I think I speak for most people when I say that we've all grown a little bit tired of this kind of act, not from Alexis Sanchez specifically, but just, players posturing and becoming petulant as a result of not getting what they want. I think in Sanchez's case, it's understandable initially for a player to be disappointed by the collapse of that kind of move, because I think we can assume that if he had moved to Manchester City, that would have come with a pretty hefty pay rise. However, it has now been more than a month, and I don't know. I mean, I think there has to be a realization point with players where they think, well, okay, that didn't happen, but then I'm still under contract with this club. I am still a teammate of this group of players, and I still owe a certain level of commitment to a particular group of fans. Sanchez is entitled to his disappointment, but I think the way that's manifesting is not problematic, but irritating, because I think if you watch him now, every time a teammate doesn't find him with the pass that he wants, or if a teammate doesn't perfectly control one of his own crossfield passes or his own sort of a flick or a back heel, there's this demonstrative show of annoyance, which seems to be, this may be terribly unfair, but to me it seems to be designed for the cameras. And so I was watching Arsenal's game on Sunday against Brighton, and obviously he created the second goal, a nice little back flick to Alex Iwobi. And I was looking back over that, and I was watching Sanchez in the build-up to that and Iwobi's movement. And at a guess, I would say that there is no way that he was aware of where Alex Iwobi was. And also, if you watch that, you see Aaron Ramsey, who is he's in a brilliant shooting position. He's on the edge of the box, right in the centre of the goal, and in a prime position just to receive a layoff from Sanchez for a shot either side of the goalkeeper. Ramsey probably scores. Ramsey's, he has some flaws as a player, but he is a good finisher. And I just thought, the back heel, and then you also you saw Sanchez's reaction after Iwobi scored. Iwobi, developing player, a nice goal. I think he actually scored on Nigeria's Independence Day, which is a nice little bit of personal symmetry for him. And obviously he was delighted. 3 points confirmed for Arsenal. And Sanchez kind of just walks off by himself. And I don't know, eventually the act's got to stop, because he's behaving as if he's surrounded by, as if he's Wilfred Zaha in the Crystal Palace team. Whereas in reality, Arsenal, I know they had a really bad day out at Anfield, but they've subsequently won 4 games in a row. They haven't conceded a goal in the process. They're level on points at Chelsea. They're a point behind Tottenham. They're not a title favourite. Of course, I think all of those roads pass through Manchester in terms of the Premier League this year. Fine. But Arsenal are a very competitive team. And I just think, look, I understand his contract is running out and that he will leave in the summer almost certainly. And he's entitled to have his, to shop himself out on the free agent market. But until then, what is the harm in just falling back into the team structure a little bit?
That's true, because you would assume that if, let's say he had 3 years left on his contract, that this sort of jostling might, it's not pleasant, but you could argue from the player's point of view in some cases that it might be necessary, to cause nuisance enough that the club decide to let you go in however many months' time. But, I mean, if his contract is coming to an end and he can leave anyway, it doesn't seem, he's where he is now. There's no changing that. So it seems like a strange attitude to choose to have. Whether it's just a kind of prolonged disappointment, and from I'm sure your own life that sometimes it's difficult to carry on as normal if you're particularly disappointed about something, to not let it show. How sure are you that it's designed?
Not at all. It's a complete guess. Nobody can know that other than Sanchez himself. But it's just either it's unintentional petulance or it's a kind of it's an act. But either way, I'm not sure either of those are particularly palatable. I also one other thing, this free agent stuff. I mean, okay, so his contract will expire at Arsenal in I think June. And I know Manchester City bid for him in the summer, but when next summer arrives and he is, a little bit closer to 30, where does Alexis Sanchez believe he's going to go? I mean, also, look, he may well be seen without a transfer fee to be paid. He may well be seen as a very good option for a big English club. But where is he going to go that he's going to start? Or where does he go where he is afforded the same status? He's not going to Manchester United because they will have no need for him. Manchester United, incidentally, are being linked with Mesut Ozil, so that would be very strange if they were to take both players on a free transfer. Manchester City, look, I could understand they could certainly afford to sign him on a free transfer or without. There aren't many financial restrictions there. But then if you look at that team as it is, in its current form with, up front, obviously, you've got Jesus and Sergio Aguero, but also, Kevin De Bruyne, Bernardo Silva, David Silva, Leroy Sané, Raheem Sterling. Look, there may well be a place in that squad, but at this stage of his career, if you were Pep Guardiola, would you probably want to sort of dance with the one that brung you?
Well, also you could argue that there would be a place in that squad for the Alexis Sanchez of 2 years ago, who was arguably the best player in the league, and the Alexis Sanchez of a particular level of desire, I think. And you mentioned in the article, it's not all negative. How incredible he's been for Arsenal in the past, because arriving sort of alongside Mesut Ozil, he has the talent, but also he's a team player, and he's you really saw that desire from him a couple of seasons ago.
It was one of the most likeable parts of his game, Joe, because it's so rare to see a player of that ability with that level of application. Marrying those two attributes is incredibly seductive for a neutral to watch.
And there might be a place in any Premier League team for that player, but he's not currently that player.
And that's the crux of the argument. I think that if you're in his situation and you are hankering after a move to a truly elite level club, I mean, of course, sort of, we've got to factor in the Bayern Munichs and Juventus. He's not going to go to Real Madrid or Barcelona, but surely it serves everyone's interest. I mean, Arsenal to have a player of his ability and his dedication, but also Alexis Sanchez's own interest to if he was to return to that kind of level and regain what was previously a flawless attitude, surely your chances of getting the move that you so obviously want increase greatly. Can you imagine a Champions League contender sanctioning a £300,000 a week contract for this version of Alexis Sanchez? Probably not.
It's in a way it's a slightly more extreme situation to refer to, but I think it was one of the things that turned some clubs off Saido Berahino. That he was intent to move, but then the attitude that he showed to the club that he was currently at, I think probably turned some of his suitors off a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think it's certainly created a red flag or two. And there are other things about Saido Berahino that we can't mention legally. But yes, I say the genesis of his kind of current decline was was this kind of protracted sulk after being denied a move to Tottenham. Incidentally, a move which it seems now wouldn't have suited him anyway, because maybe he's not quite at that level as a player. I think we certainly projected him to go a lot further than he currently has.
Well, I wanted to mention briefly talk about player power, because I think in the modern game, the advent of a player exercising their player power in the hopes of moving between clubs is fairly common, and we can look back to 1995's Bosman ruling to explain that shift in the power balance. I just wanted to mention that I thought it was interesting. When I was planning for the podcast, I read an article by Harry Redknapp, of all people, in The Telegraph, in which he recalls being West Ham manager at the time that the ruling was introduced. And he said that every chairman believed that the ruling would bring an end to transfer fees completely, and that there'd be 50 or 60 top players who were free every summer and who were heading to the clubs playing the highest wages. So I suppose that's half true. But he also mentioned that the expectation that was going to be the case was the only reason that West Ham let Rio Ferdinand go to Leeds United. The chairman thought that he'd be leaving in a couple of years anyway, and that the face of football was going to change. So yeah, it's the only reason they let Ferdinand go, which I thought I'd never heard before, and I thought was quite interesting. I wondered maybe whether Harry Redknapp was writing that one in so that he can alleviate himself of the guilt of letting him go.
I think with Harry Redknapp, when he starts talking about things that happened a couple of decades ago, you always have to you probably want to look up a few details. In that case, he's probably right. I mean, I think Rio Ferdinand, it became obvious pretty quickly that his future was not going to be at West Ham, and that, yes, had his contract run down, he would not have renewed it. Interesting that you bring it up, because actually I was at the Emirates Cup in pre-season, and it's something that Arsene Wenger said in his press conference after the first day. He was talking about, obviously in reference to Ozil and Sanchez's contractual situations. He said that he expects that to become the norm, because the wages on offer to free agents are of that caliber are so enormous that it suits them. I mean, obviously in certain situations, players are going to want to make a move. If they're within a 5-year contract, for instance. I think that the most likely change is probably not that that all top players will start letting their contracts run down. I think that the trend will be
happen more often.
It might happen more often, but as a result of players signing shorter term contracts. I mean, for players in lower leagues, obviously a 5-year deal is wonderful security. But for a player who is always going to be wanted somewhere, why would you sign for 5 years anywhere?
Why do you think it's taken so long to have that effect? Because, I mean, after the ruling was passed, I think it was pretty clear pretty quickly what was going to happen in terms of the shift from, club power to player power. But if this was going to be the case, and if all the chairmen at the time were saying, well, some of the top players will make their contracts shorter or run them down, and it's in their benefit, why do you think it's taken so long for us to get to that point?
I don't know. I think there's two sides of this. I think that if you were a club, then you would obviously go into that kind of situation with your eyes open. So if a player said, well, no, I want a 2-year contract, in response, the club could say, well, no, if you sign for X amount of years more, then we will give you an extra 20 grand a week. It's hard without a legal background or without proper knowledge of a negotiating situation. It's very hard to say, but it's not a one-sided scenario.
Well, in that case, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is Arsenal specifically, because I think you sort of said in the article, you've referenced it already here. In not so many words, you observe that Arsenal maybe aren't in the dire straits that perhaps the media or certain aspects of the public would like to make out that they are. And they might not be a front runner for the league, but they're hardly toiling, I suppose you could say. I mean, you say they're on the same points as Chelsea. They're 1 point behind Tottenham. I just wonder, generally speaking, what do you make of the team?
It's a hard question. I think Arsenal certainly have limitations. I mean, some of the traditional criticisms of them still remain true. I think they have some problems in defence, not least with the combination of defenders that they're using. I don't yet really know how good a player Rob Holding is, for instance. I think he's a good player. I don't know quite whether his long-term future is at the top of the Premier League. Again, central midfield, Granit Xhaka has started the season quite well. I think still, even though he's obviously an aging player now, I think Santi Cazorla remains a big miss for them. Because they don't really have much creativity from the middle of the pitch without him.
Well, I think also, 7 injuries in the last, or seven surgeries in the last 12 months.
Yeah, also he's a player approaching the end of his career, so you could quite easily say that Arsenal have been a little bit negligent in not trying to replace him. I think in Alex Iwobi they have a very good player in the making. Lacazette is I wouldn't call him an outstanding goal scorer, but he's a very good one. He's certainly an improvement on what they had before, and as a result of him joining, they have a very nice backup option in Olivier Giroud. Yeah. If Sanchez can be sort of brought back inside the ropes, he's obviously a huge asset. If Mesut Ozil's form can return to its best, again, big asset. Kolasinac is I don't know if he's a very good player, but he's certainly a very useful one, and certainly better than what they had. And of course, they have Peter Cech in goal. So they're not a favourite. They do not match up either player for player or squad wise with either Manchester club. I'd say that Tottenham is still superior to them. I'd say Chelsea at their best are still superior. But look, there's no reason at the moment. I think they are actually a more balanced team than Liverpool, despite what happened a few weeks ago. So the re-qualifying for the Champions League is definitely in play, and it's certainly not I don't really buy the idea that Arsenal have suddenly, just because they've dropped out of the top 4 for one season, they've suddenly become Everton.
Well, what would you do about the manager situation?
What with Wenger?
Yeah.
It's not so much what I would do now; it's probably what I would have done. I think it was a strange decision on the basis that I personally, if I was a member of the Arsenal board, I would have probably lobbied for Thomas Tuchel, because I think that he is a very good fit for the type of player they have there, and a very interesting coach, a young coach. And I think he would have been the sort of the rejuvenating factor that Wenger no longer is, or Wenger is no longer able to be. Just, it's not a criticism of Wenger; it's just a product of someone being there for a very long time. And also, the key to Arsenal's succession is not to Wenger's succession is not just getting rid of him; it's allowing him to leave. It's important that he leaves with a bit of grace, of course, but it's important that he leaves with a person to replace him, not just leave for the sake of it. And because that's always the key. There's no point in changing a manager unless you have someone that can come in and do things better. And I think that this summer would have been a good chance to do that, and it hasn't been taken.
One final thing to satisfy my own curiosity: Mesut Ozil to Manchester United is a rumour, and I get rumour and speculations, not necessarily something that we'd normally cover, but it just strikes me as a very odd. It just seems very odd to me. I don't quite understand how this would work, or why Mourinho would be interested. You say plausible. Can you?
Well, from a Mourinho perspective, it makes a lot of sense, because obviously Ozil was very successful under Mourinho at Real Madrid. It probably, I'd argue, that was the most successful part of his career.
But I mean, hasn't this season, like, Mkhitaryan has been, outstanding. Probably Manchester United's best player in parts of the season. So I'm a bit confused as to where Mourinho might envisage Ozil playing. Well,
I think that the first thing with a club like Manchester United is you remember that not every player they sign necessarily has to fit into a starting 11. I think the benefit for a club like that is that there are no real restrictions on finance. They have a blank check for every player in the world. So you could bring in a Mesut Ozil, and you could quite easily make the case that there is enough contrast between Mkhitaryan and Ozil for both to make sense within a squad situation. How they fit into a starting 11, I don't know, but then that's a question which already exists with Manchester United. How do you fit Rashford, Lukaku and Martial into the same first 11?
Well, you don't, but I think what would be concerning to supporters, I think, is that there seems to be, I think Mourinho's done an excellent job in curating a sort of delicate balance with the squad at the moment, and I suppose you get to the point where you worry about, big names coming in and displacing that. I think one of the things that the team really has going for it this season is their cohesiveness, and their collective mentality is starkly different from what it was last season and any season since Ferguson left. I think that's been Mourinho's biggest achievement. So I suppose, the worry for supporters would be not changing that.
I would take umbrage with that because I think, Mourinho has done quite a good job over the summer, and Manchester United are a very dangerous-looking side. But I wouldn't characterise. I'd characterise that more as the result of spending a lot of money. In that he has a lot of extremely talented attacking players, a very gifted midfield, and so I understand there's the hesitation with Ozil, and what does that actually make sense? You've already got a sort of a dainty left-footed playmaker in uMAXit there, who's an excellent player. Mm-hmm. What's the need for Ozil? Well, in the same way that what's the need for what was really the need for Mkhitaryan, what was the need for Matic? You don't know what else that's going to enable him to do. In terms of sort of, okay, does it allow? First thing, it obviously allows a degree of rotation. What kind of combinations can you carve out of Merzel's presence in the team? If that makes sense, these are jigsaw pieces.
We could probably talk about this forever, actually. But
and the accumulation of big players by big clubs. I understand all the concerns they write themselves, but it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever, really.
Okay, in the second part of today's podcast, we're going to go through and discuss the 5 top performing articles on uMAXit.com from the last week. So what follows is theoretically what most people were interested in hearing about, therefore statistically likely to be of interest to at least some of you. In at number 1, and we're going to do this the opposite way because I don't feel like building towards number 1 is going to create any sort of tension.
Okay.
We're not the UK top 4.
No, we're not.
Not that there's any tension in that anymore. But in at number 1 is Phil Costa on Arsenal's Alex Iwobi, who we already mentioned. That's nice. Phil writes that although the football world has moved away from the primacy of the dribbler, most of the Premier League's top clubs still have multiple players who could be described as specialists in that role, except Arsenal. However, and I quote, "There isn't a happier man than Arsene Wenger when looking back on the decision not to sell," you guessed it, Alex Iwobi. Seb, what are your thoughts on the youngster? You already sort of gave us a little sentence, but maybe you can give us a second.
Yeah, I really like Iwobi. I it's a funny one. He's someone that doesn't get spoken about a lot. He's it's not just that he's talented, and Phil's absolutely right. He's excellent on the ball, but he has so much to his game in terms of his movement and his ability to finish. I know that he still has a few flaws and he's still an imperfect player, but as opposed to the player I always compare him to favourably is Theo Walcott, because they typically occupy the same position on the field now. And I think obviously Arsenal fans have got used to seeing what Walcott does, and more importantly what Walcott doesn't do, in that his ability really stretches to being quick, finishing well in good positions, but not really contributing much. He's not someone, for instance, who's particularly good in intricate positions around the penalty box. He's a very, very predictable player, not least because his range of movement is, it's been the same for a decade, really. Iwobi I see as someone that theoretically can occupy all around the penalty box from both sides of the pitch. His delivery, not that reliable, but he's interesting because he's unpredictable. I mean, every time I've seen him live, I've seen something different from him, if that makes sense. A little bit pretentious, I understand, but there's a little bit, there's something in his game which I haven't seen before, and that's a fascinating quality, not least because, firstly, obviously because of what it allows a player to do within that particular game, but also because it allows you to imagine what he might be in the future with a little bit more refinement. And he's also a player that seems to mould himself around different players and a side. So, that kind of footballer is a great guy to have around, because no matter what you bring into the club, he seems smart enough, with brain-wise, I guess, to adjust to the trades.
Brain-wise, Seb.
Brain-wise, yeah, it is early.
Like yourself.
I haven't had an awful lot of coffee this morning, so maybe I tell you what, if you can edit in a slightly more erudite description, that'd be lovely.
I think that's probably quite good.
Brain-wise, let's go with it. But you know what I'm getting at. He's a kind of he's soft clay as a player, which is great to have. You can kind of push him into any kind of position, and I mean, not quite yet, but in a few years, you could probably feel safe that he's going to guarantee you a certain level of production and a certain level of style. He's very watchable.
Absolutely, and also I think he's pretty smart brain-wise. At number 2, this one, Seb, quite astonishing. Still in the top 5 after a month after publication. This one's the rock around the clock of the uMAXit domain, which incidentally spent 54 weeks at the UK top 40. Not the longest ever. Do you want to take a little guess? I did some research. Do you want to guess what was the longest stay in the top 40, the UK top 40 of all time?
For a single or an album?
Singles.
Is it Wet, Wet, Wet?
It's not Wet. It's Frank Sinatra, My Way.
Okay.
74 weeks.
Okay. I think Love Is All Around was... I think that might hold the record for the longest number 1. That was there for really long. Or actually, Bryan Adams, he was there too for a long time in the very early 90s.
Quite astonishing. I mean, back in the day, that equaled a lot of money.
Did indeed.
It did. So this one though, Stephen Tudor questions why Manchester United always get easy Champions League draws. So Seb, do you want to talk us through this one?
Yeah. Well, first of all, this has been popular because I think what happened is a lot of people saw the headline, got angry, didn't read it, and went to leave angry comments. Because Stephen explored the various draws Manchester United have had, group stage draws they've had in the Champions League since the competition was in its modern form. And it sounds very conspiratorial, but he actually has a point. Certainly if you compare the kind of, and seeding aside, if you compare the kind of teams that Manchester United have faced in the group stage each year, it's Stephen actually, it's worth reading, and don't just go off my description. He actually assigns a kind of an arbitrary value to the standard of teams that they've been drawn against. So Manchester United, of all the kind of what we would term European superpowers, have by far the lowest. And I think it's a very fair value.
It's a sensible point system, yeah, it is.
I think it is. It's not like Stephen is a Manchester City fan, but it's not laced with tribalism. And I understand why people got angry because, football fans sometimes can't be expected to read actual articles. It might take all of 5 minutes. But I think it's worth reading. And he doesn't draw any sort of outlandish conclusions, and he doesn't make any accusations. And he mentions, of course, that David Gill's role at UEFA, which is sorry, but it is fair. But he doesn't accuse the Champions League of being a Manchester United favoured carve up or anything like that. It's just curious. I
think what I found interesting from it was he draws a comparison to anything happening outside the football world. He said that, for example, if you were to take a situation like this over a 20-year period, if there were a finance company that was somehow seemingly and potentially totally coincidentally massively benefiting from something every year in a way that their rivals weren't, you would investigate that because you would, you'd be curious as to what was going on. It might turn out that it's completely coincidental, but it is interesting. And I think you mentioned the seeding thing there. Stephen addresses that in the article as well, and he also shows that despite them being, top seed for most of that period, so were Real Madrid, Barcelona, teams like that, and he compares the teams that they faced as well, and significantly harder still. So I think it is interesting, and it's very likely the case, as I think Stephen admits to believing himself, that they've just been very, very lucky. But it's still interesting. Yeah,
they probably have been very, very lucky. I think also one thing worth mentioning here for a bit of context is that we know that within UEFA there is an appetite for, within the bigger clubs, the established elite, to create historic wildcards, which would guarantee the participation of certain clubs within the Champions League based on what they've achieved in the past. And so knowing that, it's you have to pay attention to these things. You don't have to make accusations off the back of them. You don't have to accuse anybody of any wrongdoing, because I don't think that's really fair. And no point to Stephen do that. But it is an anomaly, and it's it's certainly one worth pointing out.
Number 3 is Kwaku Umunuquist. His article, What the N'Golo Kante signing did for Chelsea. Kwaku suggests that Chelsea have a penchant for replacing their legends with near like-for-like players, or at least players capable of rivaling their sort of ancestrous greats. Eden Hazard for Gianfranco Zola, or Ian Robben, Drogba for Hasselbank, Azpilicueta for Ferreira, the list goes on. The piece touches on the likeness of Kante and Claude Makelele. So, Seb, let me ask you, why is it that Kante, who plays in a position that is traditionally woefully underappreciated, why is it that he is universally loved and appreciated?
Well, I think because of the erroneous comparison between N'Golo Kante and Claude Makelele.
Was Makelele loved like this at the time?
Probably by Chelsea fans. I think it became, quite rightly, but still fashionably, it became sort of fashionable to praise Makelele because it was a sort of an appreciation of one of the finer points of the game. Makelele, if you talk to anyone that played in the Real Madrid side with Makelele before he joined Chelsea, they would all say that the key to their success was him, which is quite the compliment given the sort of the other players that were in that side. And also, like I think there are plenty of Frank Lampard interviews in which he talks about Makelele's role at Chelsea. I don't think there's any comparison really to make between Kante and Makelele, because Makelele, vital though he was relatively one-dimensional. His role was very much a kind of traditional, based on a traditional interpretation of the holding midfield position, whereas Kante is not a holding midfield player. That is just one part of his job description. He's actually an extremely active player. He's invaluable to the counter-attacking phases. He is not a threat from 30 yards in a shooting sense, but he is a part of Chelsea's attacking machinery, as he was at Leicester as well. So I don't know. I mean, I think he is an updated version of Makelele in the sense that the game has updated its version of Makelele's role as a whole, and Kante is probably, in the Premier League at least, probably the finest example of that. He has many more dimensions than Makelele did. Or, to be fair to Claude Makelele, he has many more. He is very hard to describe it. Makelele wasn't a limited player, but he was a player who did his role. His role has changed, so we don't know how Makelele might have performed under current conditions, is what I'm trying to say.
Number 4, a piece of archived content, re-released for its presumed relevance, written by Robert O'Connor. This article surmises that Henrik Mkhitaryan could be the leader that Bastian Schweinsteiger failed to be at Manchester United. It was written over a year ago, so now would seem the appropriate time to address it. Seb, was Rob right?
To be honest, I didn't actually sub-edit this article at the time, so it's a little bit.
What are you doing?
No, I don't know, but maybe it was something that Sam did. I think I must have been off that day, possibly, but I think it's a little bit unfair to look back on it now. I don't agree with that.
Well, in that case, explain why it's unfair to look back now, because this is a thing that happens. Journalists and bloggers and whoever write things, and then 9 months later, a year later, it laughs. Yeah, what's the problem with that? Why do you deny our laughs?
I deny your laughs because I think at the time that Mkhitaryan was signed, Manchester United were a slightly different proposition to the one they are now. I also think that. I think part of the Mkhitaryan's appeal and part of his importance was that he represented a kind of a fluidity at a time when Manchester United were a very static side, and so it was very easy to see him as a kind of a talisman for a new era. Because first and foremost, he's an outstanding player, of course he is, but also he's a particular type of footballer. Like if this is a team, for instance, that were regularly playing Marouane Fellaini in midfield. There is a chasm stylistically between those two players, of course. I think that I don't know. I don't want to say anything which can be interpreted as a criticism of Rob's article, because it's a very fine article.
It's actually very good. I mean, he is the assists leader.
Absolutely, and he's proved to be an excellent player. But I mean, in terms of
central, I think this season.
Yeah, but if you add in the emotional aspect, I think it's really unfair of us now, with Manchester United being it's so different to what they were, to kind of to analyse what's been written. Essentially a different point not a different point in Manchester United's history, but a different point in their evolution, should we say?
Okay, number 5, Seb, you made the list, albeit only because I ditched some less relevant bits to get you in.
That's very kind of you.
You weren't in the top 5.
No.
But you are in our top 5. You wrote an article titled Manchester City Success Would Be Among Guardiola's Finest Achievements. Explain yourself.
Okay, so the premise here is that one of the criticisms of Guardiola is always that his success at Barcelona was founded on inheriting a group of players that were just belonged in a different stratosphere. Messi, Iniesta, Xavi, Piqué, etc. And he's always been whipped with that. Whereas I reject that. I think one of the differences at one of the advantages he did have at Camp Nou was that a lot of those players in his first team, in what would be considered his first team, grew up on a certain style of football. They're all educated in roughly the same way, obviously, that Guardiola was too. He came through La Masia like sort of the current group of homegrown players. And so, whilst he made a lot of adjustments when he was promoted from Barcelona B to the first team, he was essentially preaching to the choir in a way, because his style was, you didn't have to have a forensic knowledge of Barcelona's history to recognise Johan Cruyff's influence in it. These are, it was based on that original doctrine. And so, yes, he vastly improved the levels of fitness in the side. He intensified the speed of their play, and he made all kinds of sort of secondary and tertiary changes to the environment too. However, at Manchester City, he obviously has the benefit of great talent. He is also the beneficiary of huge wealth, of course, and we've seen that this summer. But to play the kind of style that we're starting to see in Manchester City's game, to teach that to a group of players who have no shared upbringing. There are no common reference points, for instance, between Raheem Sterling and Kevin De Bruyne, or between Gabriel Jesus and Sergio Aguero and Bernardo Silva. These are players that have been they've been players who've been reared in different academies, not under a universal style. And yet, at the moment, it is in its formative stages, and we are nowhere close to being able to herald Manchester City as a future champion, or Guardiola as a inarguable success in England. However, you're starting to see some kind of some parallels between what he did at Barcelona in terms of the movement at the top of the field, and how well they're able to cut through teams. I mean, 10 days ago, of course, Manchester City went to Stamford Bridge, and they only won 1-0, but they comprehensively outplayed Chelsea, and at times they were wonderful to watch, and the goal they scored to win the game was just an absolute work of art. And I think to breed that level of cohesion is mightily impressive when you consider the lack of that sort of house style. And I think it's it's a hard argument to make, because we don't have solid proof of what it is. It's just, at the moment, we're 8 games into the Premier League season, and these are really just initial impressions. But I think he's covered a lot of ground. I think certainly he's covered a lot of ground between last season and this one, because Manchester City were so flawed last year. They were so vulnerable, and I think actually, in retrospect, it makes the argument. It helps make the argument, because you saw the difficulty of the Guardiola experience in trying to transplant his beliefs onto that squad. And yes, he has signed a lot of fullbacks for a lot of money and a new goalkeeper, and they've all been very important. But those attacking players, Bernardo Silva aside, have been there for a year and initially struggled. So you've seen the learning curve that they've had to go through, and you've seen sort of their struggles, and now you're beginning to see sort of what the value of Guardiola's teaching.
Not related to an article, but one final word, simply because I spoke to Alex Stewart about this the other day. What do you think about Leroy Sana? I think he's very, very entertaining to watch.
Oh, he's a wonderful player. He's just the aesthetic is great. He kind of floats across the grass. It's like he doesn't even touch the ground. He's so elegant, and also what's most interesting about him is that he is nowhere near the sort of the summit of his potential. His career's apex will probably come in 3 or 4 years' time, and can you imagine what he would be by then? I mean, once he's added kind of a little bit more composure when he's in front of goal, and when he's developed a further layer of chemistry with his teammates, I mean, he could be anything he wants to be.
Delightful stuff. Seb, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll speak to you again soon.